John Wilkinson, a 45-year-old man with weary eyes and calloused hands, stepped out of his modest home on the farm he had inherited from his father. The fresh morning air carried the scent of damp earth and unfulfilled promises. John looked out at the vast field before him, a mix of fertile soil and withered dreams. As he walked toward the barn, his thoughts drifted to a time that felt as distant as the stars, a time when his father, Thomas Wilkinson, was the beating heart of this small community in the American countryside. Thomas was known for his unwavering generosity and fervent community spirit. John could almost hear his father's voice echoing across the fields. "Son, always remember, a small act of kindness can change the world." But John's world had changed in ways he could never have foreseen. 10 years ago, on a rainy autumn afternoon, Thomas Wilkinson died while trying to repair the old community bridge. John squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push away the guilt that consumed him since that fateful day. He should have been there, helping his father. Maybe, if he had been. The distant cry of a hawk brought him back to the present. John opened his eyes and saw the small town in the distance, a shadow of what it once was. The streets, once filled with life and hope, now seemed faded and forgotten. The local school barely stood, the nearest hospital was over 50 miles away, and the dirt roads were so pockmarked that they seemed a cruel metaphor for the shattered dreams of the residents. John sighed deeply. Since his father's death, he had isolated himself, convinced that helping others was a sure path to suffering. After all, what was the point of trying when the world seemed determined to crush any spark of hope? Still, somewhere deep in his heart, a stubborn voice, one that suspiciously sounded like his father's, refused to be silenced. It was this voice that made him wake up every morning, tend to his land, and occasionally look toward the town with a mix of nostalgia and regret. Little did John know that on this seemingly ordinary day, fate was about to change not only his life but the lives of the entire community. And it would all begin with a simple choice, to stop or not to stop to help a stranger on the road. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as John drove his old truck down the dusty road toward the neighboring town. It was supply day, a routine he religiously followed every 2 weeks. The radio crackled, alternating between static and snippets of a melancholic country song, a fitting soundtrack for the barren landscape and John's dark thoughts. As he drove, his eyes scanned the familiar scenery. Every curve of the road, every solitary tree, every abandoned farm told a story of broken dreams and unfulfilled promises. John wondered, not for the first time, if he should have sold everything and left like so many others had. But something kept him there. Perhaps the memory of his father, perhaps the stubbornness inherited from generations of Wilkinson farmers. Then he saw her. On the roadside, a solitary figure was struggling beside a stopped car. Even from a distance, John could see the desperation in the woman's movements as she tried, unsuccessfully, to change a tire. His first instinct was to speed up and drive past. After all, he had his own problems to deal with. Moreover, years of isolation had fostered a deep mistrust of strangers. But then, like a ghost from the past, his father's voice echoed in his mind. "Always help when you can, John. You never know when a small act of kindness can change a life." John cursed softly, torn between the desire to keep going and the moral obligation his father had instilled in him. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the woman practically on the verge of tears, which made his heart tighten. "Damn it, Dad," John murmured, slowing down. "You always get to me, don't you?" With a resigned sigh, John turned the truck around and parked behind the woman's car. As he stepped down, he felt the scorching heat of the asphalt seeping through the soles of his worn boots. The woman looked at him with a mix of relief and apprehension. "Need some help?" John asked, his voice hoarse from lack of use. The woman, an elegant figure that seemed out of place on that dusty road, nodded frantically. "Thank God. I've been here for hours. No one stopped to help, and my cell doesn't have service." John nodded, understanding. The lack of signal was a chronic problem in that area. yet another symptom of the abandonment that plagued his community. "I'm Emily," she introduced herself, extending a hand that John shook hesitantly. "I don't know how to thank you. I have a crucial meeting in a few hours, and I thought I'd be stuck here forever." As she crouched down to examine the flat tire, John felt a twinge of curiosity. What kind of meeting could be so important as to make someone cross this end of the world? "John," he introduced himself curtly, focusing on the task at hand. The tire was completely destroyed, likely due to one of the numerous potholes that infested the region's roads. As he worked, John couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between him and Emily. She in her designer clothes and urban posture, and he, covered in dust and calluses. They were like representatives of two distinct worlds that, by a twist of fate, had met on that forgotten road. "Do you live around here?" Emily asked, an obvious attempt to fill the uncomfortable silence. John grunted an affirmation, briefly lifting his eyes from his work. "At the farm just beyond that hill," he replied, pointing with his chin. Emily followed his gaze and then looked back at John, a curious expression on her face. "It must be hard," she commented softly, "living so isolated." For a moment, John felt a wave of irritation. What could this city woman possibly know about his life? But then, looking into her eyes, he saw something that surprised him, a genuine compassion. "It wasn't always like this," John found himself saying, surprising himself. "This area used to be prosperous. We had a strong, united community. But things changed." Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the desolate landscape around them. "What happened?" John shrugged, focusing on the tire again. "Life happened. Factories closed. Young people left in search of opportunities. The government forgot about us. And then..." He paused, swallowing hard. "And then..." Emily gently encouraged. "And then people stopped caring," John concluded, his voice laden with a sadness he didn't know he still carried. "Including me." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the metallic sound of tools against the tire. John finished the job in a few minutes, feeling strangely exposed. Why was he sharing these things with a stranger? "All done," he announced, standing up and wiping his greasy hands on an old rag. Emily looked at the changed tire and then back at John, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "John, I don't know how to thank you. You literally saved my day." She rummaged in her bag, probably looking for money, but John raised a hand to stop her. "No need. Just be careful on these roads from now on. They don't forgive." Emily nodded, a serious expression replacing her smile. "Thank you, John. Really. She hesitated, as if she wanted to say something more, but then shook her head. "I will never forget what you did for me today." John watched as she got into her car and started it up. Before driving away, Emily rolled down the window and looked at him one last time. "You know, John, sometimes a small act of kindness can change everything. You may have made more of a difference today than you realize." With those cryptic words, she accelerated, leaving John in a cloud of dust and confused thoughts. He stood there for a few minutes, watching the car disappear over the horizon, an odd sensation growing in his chest. As he walked back to his truck, John couldn't stop thinking about Emily's words. They echoed his father's in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. Shaking his head to dispel those thoughts, he started the engine. After all, he had supplies to fetch and a farm to tend to. There was no time to dream of impossible changes or get carried away by the pretty words of strangers. The real world, his world, awaited him, unchanging and relentless as always. Or at least, that's what he thought. The morning after his encounter with Emily, John woke up before sunrise, as usual. But there was something different in the air, an unease he couldn't name. As he brewed his strong black coffee, his thoughts kept drifting back to their meeting the day before. Emily's words, Sometimes a small act of kindness can change everything, danced in his mind, intertwining with memories of his father. John closed his eyes, allowing himself to be swept away by a wave of long-suppressed memories. 20 years ago, young John, then 25, walked alongside his father through the green fields of the farm. The summer sun warmed their backs as Thomas Wilkinson, with his characteristic straw hat and ever-present smile, animatedly spoke about his plans for the community. "Look, John," Thomas said, pointing to the horizon. "Our land doesn't end at the farm fence. Our responsibility extends as far as the eye can see and beyond. Every person in this town is our family, and family takes care of each other." John listened, half skeptical, half amazed. "But Dad, not everyone thinks that way. A lot of people only care about themselves." Thomas paused, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. His eyes, filled with a wisdom that only years can bring, fixed on John's. "That's where you're wrong, son. People do care, but sometimes they just need a reminder. A small act of kindness can awaken humanity even in the hardest of hearts." John frowned. "And what if it doesn't make a difference? What if people don't change?" Thomas smiled, a smile that seemed to light up the whole field. "There's the beauty of it, John. We don't do good expecting reward or change. We do it because it's right. And in the end, the only person who needs to change is yourself." John opened his eyes, returning to the present. The cup of coffee in his hands had cooled, just like his heart in the years since his father's death. He stood up abruptly, feeling a sudden need for fresh air. Stepping out onto the porch, John watched the sunrise. The beauty of the moment contrasted painfully with the decay he knew existed beyond the limits of his property. His eyes landed on his father's old pickup truck, parked for years in the barn. Thomas used that vehicle not only for work on the farm but to help anyone in town who needed it. How many times had John seen him leave in the middle of the night to assist a neighbor? How many baskets of food had been delivered in that truck bed to families in need? A knot formed in John's throat. He had distanced himself from all of that, convinced that isolation would protect him from pain. But now, for the first time in years, he wondered, at what cost? His thoughts were interrupted by a distant, but growing sound. John frowned, shielding his eyes from the rising sun to try to identify the source of the noise. His heart raced as he recognized the unmistakable sound of a helicopter approaching. "What the hell?" he muttered, watching a black, imposing aircraft appear on the horizon, flying low toward his property. The helicopter hovered over the farm for a few minutes, the deafening sound of its rotor blades shattering the peace of the rural morning. John watched, astonished, as the vehicle began to move away, disappearing in the direction of the town. He barely had time to process what had happened when another sound caught his attention. A car was approaching down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust in its wake. It wasn't an ordinary vehicle. It was a sleek black sedan, elegant and clearly expensive, the kind of car rarely seen in that forgotten region. John felt his body tense. First the helicopter, now this. What was happening? The car stopped in front of the house, and John observed, suspicious, as a man in a perfectly tailored suit exited the vehicle. The stranger adjusted his tie, looked around as if assessing the place, and then walked decisively toward John. "Mr. John Wilkinson?" the man asked, his voice professional and controlled. John nodded slowly, crossing his arms. "Yes, that's me. And who are you?" The man extended his hand, which John shook hesitantly. "My name is Michael Brennan. I'm a special advisor from the Department of Rural Development. I hope I'm not bothering you this early, but we have an urgent matter to discuss." John frowned, his mind racing to understand what was happening. Rural development? Look around you, sir. There hasn't been anything developed around here for decades. Michael smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's exactly what I came to talk about, Mr. Wilkinson. May I come in?" What I have to say is best discussed sitting down. Reluctantly, but curious, John gestured toward the door. Come in. But get straight to the point. I have a farm to take care of. The two men entered the modest living room. John indicated a chair for Michael and sat down in his old armchair, the same one where his father used to sit to tell stories on winter nights. Michael took a tablet out of his suit jacket pocket and turned it on before looking directly at John. Mr. Wilkinson, what I'm about to tell you is confidential and of utmost importance for the future of this region. John leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his initial distrust. Yesterday, Michael continued, you helped a woman on the road. You changed her tire. John nodded slowly, the image of Emily coming to mind. Yes, and so. Michael smiled again, this time with a hint of admiration. That woman was Emily Dawson, the Undersecretary of Rural Development. She was on her way to a crucial meeting with the governor and federal representatives to discuss the future of rural communities in crisis, like her own. John felt his heart race. Emily, the woman he had helped, was a significant figure in the government. He tried to maintain his composure, but his mind was spinning with the implications. Go on, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Michael leaned forward, his eyes shining with contained enthusiasm. Thanks to your help, Mr. Wilkinson, Emily made it to the meeting on time. And not just that, your story, your brief encounter, became the focal point of her presentation. John blinked, confused. What do you mean? Emily used her experience, the state of the roads, the lack of cell service, but above all, your kindness in stopping to help, as a living example of what is wrong and what is right in our rural communities. She argued that if people like you still exist, willing to help despite all the difficulties, then these communities deserve a second chance. John felt a wave of conflicting emotions, surprise, pride, and a hint of shame for his years of isolation. And what does that mean exactly? Michael smiled widely. It means, Mr. Wilkinson, that your town has been chosen as the pilot for a new rural revitalization program. We're talking about massive investments in infrastructure, health, education, and economic development. John's jaw dropped. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Michael, noticing his shock, continued. In the coming months, you will see significant changes around here. A new hospital will be built, schools will be renovated and equipped, roads will be paved, and we will implement a state-of-the-art drinking water system. John finally found his voice. All this, because of a flat tire? Michael shook his head, his face serious. No, Mr. Wilkinson. All this because of an act of kindness. Emily could have been stuck on that road for hours, missed the meeting, and none of this would be happening. Your small gesture triggered something much bigger than you could have imagined. His father's words echoed in John's mind. A small act of kindness can change everything. He felt his eyes welling up with unshed tears. What happens now? John asked, his voice trembling. Michael stood up, extending his hand. Now, Mr. Wilkinson, we would like to invite you to be part of the local committee that will oversee these changes. Your perspective and knowledge of the community will be invaluable. John looked at the outstretched hand, feeling the weight of history, his father's, the entire community's, on his shoulders. For a moment, he hesitated, years of disillusionment and isolation weighing against this unexpected opportunity. Then, almost without realizing it, he found himself shaking Michael's hand. I accept, he said, his voice gaining strength. It's time to make the difference my father always wanted to see. Michael smiled, a genuine smile this time. Excellent. Welcome aboard, Mr. Wilkinson. We're about to make history together. As Michael prepared to leave, handing John a folder full of documents and information about the project, John felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He looked out the window at the fields his father loved so much, and for the first time in a long while, he saw not just the past, but a future full of possibilities. That night, alone on his porch, John looked up at the stars and whispered, "You were right, Dad. A small act of kindness really can change everything." The days that followed Michael Brennan's visit were a whirlwind of activity for John. The news of the revitalization program spread through the town like wildfire, bringing with it a mix of emotions: hope, skepticism, excitement, and fear of the unknown. John found himself at the center of it all, a position that left him deeply uncomfortable. Years of isolation had not prepared him to be suddenly thrust into the spotlight of community attention. One particularly hectic afternoon, as John tried to balance his responsibilities on the farm with the endless meetings of the Revitalization Committee, he received an unexpected visit. "John, are you there?" A familiar voice called from outside the house. Stepping out onto the porch, John found Margaret Thompson, the retired teacher who had taught nearly every child in town for the past 4 decades. Her wrinkled face was marked by an expression of concern. "Ms. Thompson," John greeted her, descending the porch steps. "What brings you here?" Margaret looked around, as if checking to see if they were alone, before speaking. "John, dear, I'm worried. All this talk about change and development. You really think it's a good idea?" John frowned. "What do you mean?" The elderly woman sighed, her tired eyes reflecting years of disillusionment. "We've seen this before, haven't we? Politicians making big promises, stirring up people's hopes, and then nothing. What if it's just another trick? What if we're gearing up for another disappointment?" Margaret's words hit John like a punch to the stomach. They echoed his own doubts, the fears he had been suppressing since the beginning of all this. For a moment, John remained silent, staring at the fields stretching beyond his property. Then, to his own surprise, he heard himself say, "Mrs. Thompson, remember what my father always said. Hope is like a seed. Even buried in darkness, it always seeks the light." Margaret smiled sadly. "Your father was a wise man, John. But sometimes I wonder if he was just a dreamer." John shook his head, feeling a conviction he didn't know he still possessed. "Maybe. But it was the dreamers who built this community in the first place. And it will be the dreamers who rebuild it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Look, I understand your fear. I've spent years disillusioned myself. But what if this time is different? What if this is our chance to honor everything our parents and grandparents worked for?" Margaret studied him for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, John, you sound just like your father now. He would be so proud." John felt a lump in his throat. "I hope so, Mrs. Thompson. I really hope so." As Margaret said goodbye, promising to think about what John had said, he found himself reflecting on their conversation. Was it true that he was starting to sound like his father? And if so, was that a good thing? In the days that followed, John threw himself into the Revitalization Committee's work. He spent hours studying the proposed plans, questioning every detail, ensuring that the real needs of the community were being met. One afternoon, during a particularly tense meeting at the town hall, John found himself passionately advocating for the inclusion of a community center in the development plan. "It's not just about infrastructure," he argued, his voice echoing across the packed room. "We need a place where people can come together, share ideas, rebuild the sense of community we've lost over the years." There was a murmur of approval in the crowd. John saw faces that had shown nothing but resignation for years now shining with a glimmer of hope. It was in that moment that he realized something was truly changing. And it wasn't just the town, it was him. That night, alone at home, John picked up an old photo of his father. In it, Thomas Wilkinson smiled broadly, surrounded by community members during the inauguration of the Old Town Park, a project he had led. "I'm trying, Dad," John whispered to the photo. I'm really trying to make the difference you always wanted to see." Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the town's landscape began to change. The pothole-riddled roads gave way to new, smooth asphalt. The skeleton of the new hospital began to rise on what was once a vacant lot. The schools got fresh paint, new equipment, new life. But the most significant change, John realized, wasn't in the buildings or the roads. It was in the people. There was a new spark in the residents' eyes, a renewed energy in their steps. People began to gather again, to talk, to dream. One Saturday, while walking through the town observing the progress, John was approached by a group of young people. "Mr. Wilkinson," said a girl no older than 16, "we wanted to thank you. Dad says it's because of you that all this is happening." John felt his face heat up. No, this is a community effort. You've given us hope again," interrupted a boy. "Before, we all planned to leave as soon as we could. Now we're thinking about staying, about building something here." The words of the young people struck John like a bolt of lightning. He had always thought he was doing this for the memory of his father, for the generation that built the town. But now he realized, it was about the future, about giving the next generations a chance to thrive in their own land. That night, sitting on his porch, looking at the town that was slowly coming to life again, John felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He closed his eyes, letting the night breeze caress his face, and whispered, "You were right, Dad. A small act of kindness can really change everything. And sometimes, the most important change happens within ourselves."
Mal sabia John que o verdadeiro teste de sua recém-descoberta fé na comunidade e em si mesmo estava prestes a chegar. Uma tempestade se aproximava, tanto literal quanto figurativamente, que iria desafiar tudo o que eles haviam conquistado até agora.
Summer gave way to autumn, and with it came the first storm clouds. John was on his farm, checking the fences, when he felt the change in the air. The smell of the storm was in the air. Dark clouds appeared on the horizon, slowly advancing like a threatening and inevitable presence. The wind began to blow fiercely, lifting dust from the road and shaking the trees around John's farm. He was outside, checking the fences, when he felt the first cold raindrop hit his face. In a matter of minutes, the sky closed in, and the distant sound of thunder resonated across the fields. John looked down the road leading to the town, his thoughts consumed by an unease he couldn't name. The new roads, the buildings that were starting to sprout where there had once been only abandonment, all of this was at risk. But what worried him most was the safety of the people. If the storm was as severe as it seemed, the town could suffer serious damage, something the community might not be prepared to face. He needed to act. Quickly, John climbed into his old truck and sped down the road toward the town. Along the way, the rain began to fall harder, creating puddles along the sides of the road and making visibility difficult. Upon arriving in town, he found the community hall already filled with worried residents, many of whom were still not fully recovered from the hardships of recent years. The new renovations of the town were still in process, and there was no certainty that everything would survive that storm. As soon as John entered the hall, the chatter ceased. All eyes turned to him. Though he didn't like the idea of being the center of attention, he had inevitably become a figure of leadership in the community. Michael, the government advisor, was also there, talking to some residents, while Emily stood near the door, looking outside as if calculating the impact the storm would bring. "We need a plan," John said, taking center stage without hesitation. "This storm isn't going to be mild, and if we're not prepared, everything we've worked for could be destroyed." A heavy silence fell over the room. Margaret Thompson, the old teacher, was the first to speak. "What can we do, John? We are vulnerable, as we have always been." John shook his head. "We're not alone. We have more resources now, but we need to organize. Let's ensure everyone is safe and then protect the most vulnerable buildings." Emily approached John, nodding in approval. "We can start by sending people to emergency shelters. We need to evacuate the lower areas of town. The roads are being reinforced, but some still wouldn't withstand flooding." "I'll take care of that," John replied without hesitation. "Margaret, you and some of the young people can help organize the transport for the families. We need to make sure no one is left behind." Margaret, who had always been skeptical, now looked at John with a mixture of pride and hope. "Of course, John. We'll do this." As the storm raged over the town, the community worked in unison. John moved back and forth, helping to organize the efforts. The newly built hospital was prepared to house those who couldn't move. The most fragile houses were evacuated, and residents came together to protect the most important buildings. During a brief lull in the rain, John found Emily next to the hospital, watching the horizon with concern. "Do you think it will pass?" she asked, looking at him with an anxious expression. John shook his head, exhaling deeply. "I don't know. But we will endure, as we always have." Emily smiled, despite the situation. "I saw you take charge today. Your father would be proud, John." Her words hit John like a punch to the stomach. He knew how much his father believed in the strength of the community, but until recently, he himself had abandoned that idea. Now, however, he felt he was finally fulfilling what Thomas had always wanted. "I'm just doing what's right," he replied humbly. Before they could continue, a thunderous boom echoed through the air, a thunder that seemed to split the sky in half. The storm intensified in a frightening manner. John and Emily ran inside the hospital, where doctors and nurses were preparing for a possible flood. Night fell, bringing with it the worst of the storm. The streets of the city began to flood, and the new roads, which had once been a source of hope, now seemed fragile in the face of nature's power. John, Emily, and Michael joined the volunteers to monitor the damages. Around midnight, one of the young men who was helping John ran into the community hall. "The dam is having problems," he shouted out of breath. "If it breaks, the low part of the city will be destroyed." Without thinking twice, John grabbed his tools and rushed to the dam. The structure, which hadn't received proper maintenance in years, was visibly damaged. With the help of some local men, he worked frantically, battling against the rain and wind, trying to save the city from a disaster. The situation was critical, but John didn't give up. He remembered his father's words, "You never give up on what matters." In the most desperate moment, with the dam about to break, John and the others managed to temporarily stabilize the structure, just long enough for the residents of the low area to be evacuated. When the sun finally began to rise on the horizon, the storm had passed. The city, although damaged, had endured. The residents gathered in the town center to assess the damages. The hospital, the school, and the roads had suffered some damage, but they were still standing. The community was tired but intact. John stood on the porch of the community hall, watching as people began to clear the debris. Margaret, the young people, Emily, and even Michael came together in this effort. He smiled, for the first time in a long while, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Emily approached him, covered in mud but with a sparkle in her eyes. "You did this, John. You saved the city." John looked at her, thoughtful. "It wasn't just me. We all did this. That's what my father always wanted to teach me. It's not about one man alone. It's about what we can do together." Emily smiled, nodding. "Your father was right. And so are you. This is just the beginning." In the weeks following the storm, the city began a new process of rebuilding. Now, however, there was a renewed spirit. John, alongside Emily and other community members, led the efforts to ensure that the revitalization program went beyond infrastructure. Now, there was a focus on uniting the city. John returned to his farm a changed man. The isolation he had cultivated for years disappeared, replaced by a deep connection to the community his father had so loved. As he looked out over the vast fields under the clear autumn sky, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. And with that, he whispered to the wind, as if his father could hear him. "You were right, Dad. A small act of kindness can truly change everything." If you enjoyed this story and want to follow more content like this, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. And to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming videos, activate the notification bell. This helps us continue bringing more exciting stories to you. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.